In today's video, I'm going to give some tips over how I DIY'd my way into a frame for a pastel piece of art. Now, this is very specific. It's not like other picture frames. Plenty of people make box picture frames. That's the general style here. But due to a pastel's nature, you have to build it differently. The way pastel works is it more or less sort of sits on top of the canvas rather than paint where it adheres, so you cannot press it up against glass. The art has to be offset from the glass, providing some interesting challenges. You also can't have any kind of vibration, or at least much of it. It will shake off, and you have to appear to kind of accept that over time some of the dust will fall off. So you have to have a way for that to fall without kind of gathering around the glass. So I've done a relatively cheap kind of DIY way here, and I just wanted to share some tips. Now, I'll give you some vague dimensions, but I can't give you exact dimensions. And the reason I'm not doing a step-by-step is that the artist, unbelievable artist, she gave me a piece that's not actually 9 by 12. The way she cut it, it's off on either side. So my dimensions are very specific for that. I bought 9 by 12 glass thinking I was getting 9 by 12. So I have a couple different levels of grooves to offset the art, which is larger than the actual glass. So that's the reason why this is not a total step-by-step with exact dimensions, but I'll give you the rough dimensions. So let's start with the materials. And again, this is the DIY version. I'm not buying anything other than the glass I didn't buy from frame shops. The first is this foam board. I got this at the dollar store, a whole sheet of it for, I don't know, $1.25, whatever dollar store stuff costs now. This is exactly what you want in terms of dampening vibrations. It's relatively light, and it's a good spacer and dampening vibration. Now, one of the key problems here is that because my glass and painting were a different size, I couldn't hide everything around the lip. So instead of being able to use this as the front spacer, I had to go with strips of wood because you could see through the glass into here. And as you'll notice, this is white on the side and it's hard to cut super clean. So I had to end up using this as a matting behind to help with absorption and to help with not putting too much pressure on that. But I went with my own wood spacers on the inside, and we'll walk through the layers here. Now, one thing I highly suggest if you're kind of starting new, or if you're like me and your artwork is not the identical size to the glass, in the end, this hardboard, very useful for this. This is like $8 for a 2x4 sheet at Home Depot or Lowe's. I love it. I use it for a lot of stuff. But what it's really good for is not only making the back of this, but for making templates. I had my glass size, and then I had the size of my art. Now, I'm also going to be affixing my art to this to kind of give me something to hold on to, but I needed to have these two different sizes to then test my grooves. So I highly suggest going with this, just even for the backing. It's super cheap, it's relatively sturdy, it's pretty light, and it's thin enough that you can kind of play with the amount of layers if need be. If you want to make your box frame a little deeper or less deep, this is thin enough that you can change dimensions by about 3/16 or an eighth of an inch just to play with it. So the overall cost really of this was not much. Maybe, I think it was $15, $20 for the piece of walnut this came out of, though I've got some left. $8 for the hardboard, $1.25 for the foam board. And then I just went on Amazon and I'm going to be using a sawtooth hanger. That seemed like the easiest way. I needed to fix it to the wall without having to shake it much. So I was thinking of doing keyholes originally, but I decided to step away from that because if you've ever done 2 keyholes or even just one, trying to get it on there, it's gonna shake it, and it cannot be shaken a whole lot. And then I'm also just using these little pressure pushers to hold it in there. I'm gonna affix them to the outside instead of cutting a slot underneath. That just seemed like an unnecessary mess. They're a thin metal, so they're a bit flexible, so you can bend them one way so that when you screw them down, it then applies pressure. I think these are a really good idea, and they're shallow enough that our spacer on the back won't have to be too big. So in terms of materials costs, you're looking at maybe $35 for this part, and then the glass was a bit expensive. The glass itself is not expensive, but shipping a piece of glass is like $20 plus the $7 glass. So maybe $60, including the hardware for this whole thing. And I've got enough hardware to make another 100 picture frames. So let's come in closer and I'll show you what I did and the layers of how I stacked this up. I want to talk about the basic concept here. Now, this front piece is going to be the frame, though of course the frame holds over all of this. But the problem is the artwork here cannot touch the glass, which will sit right here. We need this spacer in between to keep them separated, We then need a mat behind to help with vibration and to allow something to press into the artwork to hold it together without being kind of a hard press. It'll absorb a little bit. So we've got the foam matting there, and you can use numerous layers of that if you want. And then the hardboard in the back, just to keep it all closed in, and it gives something kind of more firm for the little holders to press into. Again, you can toy with the amount of layers you want. And professionals, as far as I can tell, use that kind of that kind of foam matting layer as this spacer. They sell pre-cut ones that don't have a white edge. If you want to spend the money on that, that's probably going to be even easier than having to cut thin spacers yourself. But I wanted to keep this as low cost as possible. So this is essentially what we're looking at. We've got the outer frame, the glass, the spacer, the art, the mat, and then the backer. So 5 or more layers. Now in my case, because my picture was a different size than my glass, I couldn't just cut one groove straight down. I had to cut 2 separate grooves. The picture is not only longer, but also wider than the glass. So it couldn't even just be 2 separate grooves one way. I cut a single groove for the glass that was just slightly below the distance, as close to flush, but with a little bit below so that the spacer would then sit right up on the glass. So then my glass sits in this area. So there is a shelf created around the glass here that the artwork then sits upon there. So 2 separate grooves. And this was a bit challenging and took some trial and error to get right so that I had a relatively firm fit. But because of the vibration problems, you can't have a ton of pressure when you're trying to actually slide it all together to get it in there yourself. You almost need a little bit of a gap, a few hairs of a gap, so that it slides in without any kind of friction hitting it. They're delicate pieces of art, pastels. So we'll go in closer to the actual piece itself, and I'll show you these layers here. So this is the interior of the frame. You can see we have one groove that goes further down but is narrower on both sides, and then a larger groove which is the thickness of the glass plus or minus just a little bit but wider. And that way when I grab my templates, I can sit the glass down in there. Remember, this is not glued together yet, so it's a little bit loose. And that way that lines up with this second shelf here. Now the shelf is for these spacers, which I just made out of hardwood, similar to this because you can see them through the glass. But one of the keys with the spacers is that we want the bottom spacer to be slightly below the lip of the frame. And that way, when any dust falls, it sits below this outer lip right here. It will be cradled down in there, so you will not be able to see the dust through the glass. That's kind of important here, or else you're gonna have a buildup of dust on your glass. So we've got the glass, the spacers, and then, like I said, I'm going to affix the artwork to this. There's a special kind of masking tape. I don't know if it's called glassine, something like that, which I'm just going to affix in the corners because my picture is actually the size of this whole thing, but I've marked out where will be hidden behind the frame. So I have a little room to tape up in these corners and not have it seen. That will go on top like so. And then I will be using the foam matting, what will be then a second layer of foam matting, and then I will have the final backer board on there. And that keeps that nice and solid with the glass pressed up against there. But you can hear nothing is going to be moving at all. Whoops. And then, like I said earlier, I'm going to use the sawtooth hanger and these little pinchable guys. The nice thing is you can pinch them in one direction or another. If you want, you can cut a groove inside of this and slide them in. That seemed like an unnecessary amount of work. So I'm going to bend them in an arch upward so that when I screw them down in, they will apply downward pressure. And I'm going to use 2 on every side. I do not want this to break. It was not a cheap piece of art. And it's a gift for my mother, so I'm being very careful with that. Again, these were only like $4 for a million of these things. And then after you get all of those on there, we'll take a measurement of exactly how far this sits off. And I'm going to just take a piece of walnut and then put little kind of bottom, I'll call them bumpers, so that it sits on the wall nice and flat, just matching exactly this size. So relatively simple. I'm just going to walk you through now kind of the rough way that I made the grooves, so you can decide whether you want to go that route or not. But before that, let me just give you the dimensions I ended up with here in case for whatever reason you care. Now, one of the keys in terms of dimension to any kind of frame where you're going to be doing miters, or in this case, a bevel, is that you need some glue surface. I started out test pieces that were much thinner than this, but I realized by the time I got to the end, I had almost nothing left. Not only barely any to glue, but then to put my splines through, it would almost just be nothing. And so I immediately then went and started with some thicker wood. I got this at 1 inch raw and planed it down. I just took about a 1/16 off, so 15/16. That leaves me with a good amount of glue surface, and we're still hogging out so much that it's not heavy. It's not like this giant thing sitting on the wall, but I certainly advise you start with relatively thick wood, and I wouldn't want to go under 7/8 of an inch to start because of how much you have to remove and how much of your glue surface you lose, and also room to spline through without having to deal with chopping them off inside of here. So with that in mind, knowing that I started or planed down to 15/16 of an inch of wood, my overall frame ended up at 10 5/8 by 13 and a little under a half. Now, in terms of the groove for the glass, if your artwork is exactly the same size as the glass, this is going to be nice and simple for you. You won't have to do 2 grooves. I went just simply a hair or 2 over 9 and a hair or 2 over 12 so that I could get the frame in there without having to press down on the glass because we don't want to leave a ton of smudges on there. So essentially you're just matching your frame with the groove, or your glass and artwork with the groove. And unfortunately, if they'd been the same size, I wouldn't have had to take out so much extra to fit this, and I'd have even more glue surface, and I would be thrilled about that, but I don't. So let's talk now about how I cut these grooves and why it was a little sketchy, and I'm not sure if it's the best way, but I'll show you how I did it. The way I did this, and keep in mind I do not have a dado stack, is that I obviously needed to get 2 separate grooves cut out, one very far up for the glass to sit in. Now, of course, that causes a large problem. When you get to the top, you have almost no reference surface sitting on there. This is all that's going to be sitting on this fence, and you need to keep it at 90 degrees. And the reason I didn't do it on the table saw is as it goes through the router, I can at least keep it pressed up against the fence with the featherboard all the way. On the table saw, you would just come in like this if you had to make a second pass. So I just used a 1/4 inch spiral bit and used these featherboards to keep it up against. Now you can see though how hard that is. So I used a push stick to stay down, and this actually worked really well, though it felt quite sketchy in the end. To make that first groove all the way, then I needed to go like 3/8 of an inch. So I whipped out the straight bit. This is just the biggest one I had, and I cut the separate groove. And I did these in 1/16 increments because I just was so afraid of shattering it as it got thinner and thinner, especially on the top here. It took quite a while to do. But this was the safest way I could think of doing this. I don't have like a router, plane, hand tools, or any of that, so that was just not an option for me. It was just a featherboard. I actually ended up putting it right in the middle here to keep pressure over, and then this one on the outboard side. And it actually worked really well. I got nice clean grooves, even grooves all the way. So if you're trying to figure out how to do this, especially if you have to do double grooves, this is the way I did it. I'm sure there are other ways some people do it. And because of how many layers you need for a pastel, you end up having to take quite a bit out. That's why it's one of the unique things about the pastel frame is you need so many layers, spacers, glass, the artwork, the matting. It gets a little sketchy. You don't have this really thick piece that can just sit up against there. So hopefully this helps. I ended up using the straight bit purely because of the height. If you want, you can use one of these slot cutting bits or rabbiting bits. That's what I'm looking for. This is essentially just a giant rabbit rebate, whatever you want. But I wanted to be able to take out the entire depth at once while also taking out, by at once, I mean per cut. And this just felt like a big cutter head slapping it each time when I tried. So I went with a slightly narrower bit so that I wasn't, not as much force coming back against it. It just felt smoother to go with the spiral bit and then even this straight bit rather than having the mass of this going through each time. So that's just me. If you want to cut it a different way, by all means. If you know of like a secret way that people do these easier, leave it in the comments. This was the best I could come up with, and it felt a lot less sketchy than on the table saw, but it still felt a little sketchy. I'm gonna get this all glued up and we'll have a look afterwards. I'm gonna throw 2 splines in either corner. I would certainly use some splines in this instance. The glass is not light, even though the other things here are relatively light, but there's gonna be a piece of art in here. We want this as strong as possible. I just treat this style like a box frame, and I cut it with my box splining jig. Some people on normal mitered frames ride up against the fence. I don't do that, but as long as you've got some thickness, in this area, you can treat this like a box, especially if this is your first introduction to splines. Highly suggest at least 2 on this. I went with 3 for aesthetics, but 2 I think would be ideal in terms of I guess minimum would be what I say. I don't think 1 is enough here. There's just so little glue surface left on these miters after removing this rabbet, essentially, that we need some extra strength here. Now, I like using a contrasting wood, but not necessarily a light and white maple. I like cherry here. The dog that's in the portrait has some kind of orangish tones to it, so it works well. I like to cut these slightly over. You're essentially looking for a piece of wood that is the same thickness as your kerf of your saw blade. However, I would warn you that on this, you're not going to be able to mallet these in there. So I actually like to cut slightly over and then either hand plane or sand my way down to a good fit. Normally, I want a pretty good friction fit where I have to press it in there because I'm going to be malleting it in. On this one, I want a little bit under, and I like to add just the gentlest of a slope. I like to skew the plane a little bit because when we add glue in there, it takes up space. While it's still wet before the water has evaporated out of it, it's got, a mass to it, and you will not be able to fit it in there with only hand pressure if you cut this exactly to size and then add glue. And the little back bevel allows for the glue to just kind of have a place to move. I mean, we're talking so minute, you can't really see it, but you know it's there because you did it. So that is my suggestion here. Be careful with the thickness of your splines, just a little bit, a hair, we're just talking a little bit, 1 thin plane shaving under, and you will then be able to just use your fingers to get it in there and not have to mallet. One tip I have when it comes to cutting the spline waste off is that you can do it on the bandsaw, but you got to be careful because as those teeth are coming down, it can pull it and it can kind of tear out the end a little bit. And also these higher ones, the material is not being cut on the table, so they can kind of be pulled and they'll slam on the table and then kind of fly up or whatever. So eyeglasses for sure. I've done a lot of them on there. I've had a few go bad. I've stopped doing them on there. Now I just generally flush trim. I think this is the safest, easiest way. I prefer only to go about a little over halfway through, then flip it around and go about halfway through the other side, then cutting it off. I usually don't get it perfectly flat, and I end up just having to rub a little sandpaper over that. You can also just go with a normal joinery saw or whatever saw, and then again, just sandpaper, whatever you want to do on the edge there. Just be very careful. These are delicate at the very tip. They can tear out. And you don't want to get this far and then have it tear out. Now you've got to round the edge over or else you've got this tear out and it's a whole mess. So be very careful. This seems like a very simple task, but it can go very wrong if you aren't gentle. So here is the finished frame. I decided for the finish just to go with a boiled linseed oil, though I did burnish everything to get a little bit of a sheen kind of going. I didn't want anything plasticky. I didn't want anything that would take away from the photo itself. Obviously this is going to get touched, 5 times, once to put the photo in, once to hang it, and then potentially a couple times if it ever gets moved. So I'm not too worried about needing some kind of really hard, durable finish here. You can do whatever you want. If you want some high gloss, lacquer is probably the easiest. Just spray it on there. I don't think that's necessary. I obviously, again, went with the sawtooth hanger on the back, and then I just put these little pincers on the outside and I'll just press them down and in. If you want to do a groove and slide them in and under and attach them to the back, have at it. I don't think that's just a necessary thing here. And then the only other thing left is to take your measurement of whatever your highest point is. For me, that was this sawtooth hanger at about 5/30 seconds. And then I just got some walnut little strips and just super glued them onto the bottom so that when it sits against the wall, it is not kind of like hanging off. It's got a nice firm backing on there. So I'm super happy with this. I will bring in a slightly closer shot. I think the splines worked out really good. And there is the frame. You can see the little splines. Really happy with that. I like this walnut. And there is the back. Pretty simple. A few little spacers. I kind of wanted to put 3 to give an equal balance. You can do however many you would like. That's going to do it for us today. I am not a professional framer. I'm just doing a DIY here, but hopefully what I've learned through doing this pastel framing will help you out if you're doing your own. And you can obviously do this with another type of picture as well. It doesn't have to be for a pastel. If you like this box style, have at it. But hopefully this keeps your pastel safe and provides a nice frame and just gives you a little head start on what you need to know when you're building it. Have a good one.